Wonder of wonder, we have another video, an actual video. As I mentioned, I have plenty of stuff to talk about. I just have to actually sit down and talk about it. And unless something else comes up, one of my next videos will be a list of things that I'm going to ask if anybody wants to hear about preferentially first before anything else. So, but that's not what this is. This is an actual new idea, something that I had not planned to talk about before. And there's a lot of backstory to it, so let's get to that first. The prompting incident, the thing that caused this video to happen was, as we all know, I play a game, it's called Savage Worlds, is the game system, and the campaign setting that we play in is Hellfrost. And I play that on Friday or Saturday every week, hopefully. We've been meeting on a weekly basis. And a couple last week, the DM had posted a link to a message board from the company that makes the game to clarify a rule about one of the characters. One of the guys is playing a paladin of Eartha, which is one of the goddesses. Funny enough, the goddess of the earth. And there was a clarification that when you become one of these paladins, you get spells. And in the book, I guess it had mentioned that you get two spells and the signature spell for the deity. But what they meant was you get two spells total, and one of them has to be the signature spell for the deity. So our dude who had three spells suddenly went down to two spells. All well and good. But when I followed the link to that message board, I decided to take a look at some of the other stuff that they had there. And one of the threads buried deep down was about a typo, well, what the guy considered a typo in an adventure module. It had said that there were two doors in the adventure that were mentioned as being invisible. And he posted a question saying, "What do you mean by an invisible door? What would be the point of an invisible door? You would just see through to the room beyond. Maybe you'd just walk into it and smack your nose." And then the author said, no, he says camouflage is a trapping of invisibility. Now, in Savage Worlds, the powers are deliberately vague. They are generic game rules, but without any what is called fluff or flavor text. So you would have a generic power called Bolt, and it's just a ranged attack that deals damage. And then on top of that, you add your trapping. So, for example, our paladin, who's a cleric of the Earth Goddess, or a paladin of the Earth Goddess, has the Bolt power. And his trapping is that spikes shoot up out of the ground, like, big stalagmites shoot up out of the ground and stab the guy. And our wizard is a necromancer trapping. And so his bolt power is actually just like these purple energy bolts that when they hit you cause you to wither. So they both use the exact same spell, but the trapping changes it. And so what the author was saying was that those doors are invisible, but the trapping is camouflage, so that you can't see it, not that you see through it. And I called BS on that. But it brought up this interesting thought. And that was, what if there was a door in a dungeon that was invisible? And the point of that door was so that you would see through it, think that it's just like an open archway, and then bonk your head on the door. And the only thing that would do that kind of thing is a gnome. Gnomes like to pull pranks, and that would be right up a gnome's alley. And immediately in my brain came, oh my gosh, the tomb of the Gnome King. And so that is sort of what this video is about, as probably mentioned in the title. And that's where this picture came from. It's very difficult actually to find a picture of this. Someone at a door, and then the door opens up a trap door, and then they fall through it. I mean, it's very common. It's an incredible staple of comedy and adventure films, and yet so difficult on Google to find the correct search terms to pull this out. So, what is the Tomb of the Gnome King? Well, as I just mentioned, gnomes are known for pulling tricks, and in this case, I wanted a dungeon where I could put all the nastiest, funniest tricks and traps. And specifically, I want the thing that I got was more so than just an invisible door where you walk into it. There are invisible traps. Imagine a pendulum, like there's a bridge you have to cross, and there's those big bladed pendulums swinging across. Now imagine that they were invisible. You could hear them, maybe, but you couldn't see them, and you would have to somehow navigate your way across. That would be scary. Imagine, in another instance, a boulder. Just like in Indiana Jones, that giant boulder comes down and starts rolling after you, and so you have to run. And you're heading through this corridor at full speed trying to outrun this giant boulder. And there happen to be there's like a wall of spikes that drops down, but the spikes and the wall are invisible, so you don't see them. And while you're running from this boulder, boom, you run smack dab into a spiked wall that was completely invisible before. That would be nasty and rude, and that's just the kind of thing I want. And you have to, of course, start it off with what we see here in the picture. If you try to go through the front door of the dungeon, it drops you down a pit trap, and now you are locked into my fun house until you manage to find a way out. This is for the sandbox game. That is the point of it. This would be one of those, it would be a rare dungeon where if PCs decide to poke around, they actually get trapped there and now are forced to find their way out. I would not make it a hard force. And by hard force, I mean I wouldn't make it so that if you happen to have fallen down this trapdoor, you now have no choice other than getting your way, finding your way through the dungeon. You would be allowed to try and climb out of the pit. There would be, there'd be a couple encounters that would lead you to an alternate exit so that you can get out or choose to go further into the dungeon. And because you want to give players that choice. You don't want to kind of trap them in a dungeon, especially one that's going to be such a, oh, there's so many little words you could use for it, but just like an asshole-ish dungeon where everything is out to kill you and nothing is what it seems. I mean, imagine that pendulum. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's going to happen in there. So you come across, you have to layer mind game on mind game. You come across that bridge spanning a chasm, and down at the bottom of the pit or the chasm, there's spikes. And now you can hear as you approach. You have the players roll a notice or a listen check, and they can hear, and then that's the sound of the big bladed pendulum swinging. Now they can try and make it through just by kind of. What I like about this, I'll get to that in just a sec. They can try to make their way through, and even if someone has like the see invisibility spell, they'll definitely be able to see the pendulums, and they can try and make their way across the bridge. The thing though is, despite the fact that the pendulums are invisible, the reason why the Gnome King left the sound there is so that when you try to cross that bridge and you're carefully making your way past these pendulums, like you can feel it rush by in front of you, so then you step past it and then you wait for the next one. The middle of the bridge collapses and drops you into the spiked pit trap. And it's just so wonderful. I mean, I can see it would be an asshole-ish place to go. No player would ever want to be in this dungeon, and that's kind of the point. You wanted to make places where the PCs could go and maybe not have the ability to get further, either because the challenge is too great, like the monsters are too powerful, or they don't have the correct spell or riddle or key or ability to get through a particular door or across a pit without there's no bridge across this 150-foot gap. How do we get over there until we get fly? Stuff like that. Well, in this case, it would be a dungeon that is just so aggravating and irritating and paranoia-inducing that players would not want to continue further. They would go through, get their butt kicked by all these traps and tricks and puzzles, And then they're like, you know what, screw it, we're gone. And then they leave. And then the next time they show up, maybe they're higher level, they think they can get past it now. Or maybe they just find a group that's more willing to put up with that crap. They decide to go back and give it another try. You would definitely have to have some good magic items at the end. Although, some players, and this would be something that I would expect too, there would be no treasure at the end because that's exactly what the Gnome King would do. He would, you head all through this dungeon and get past all these tricks and traps, and then finally you get to the treasure room and there's like a copper piece sitting there in the ground, and then a note from the Gnome King telling you very rudely to go do something to yourself. I like it. This is one of my favorite ideas. The biggest trick is just being able to put together tricks and traps where in such a manner that the players, one, are constantly getting fooled, two, can occasionally outthink the Gnome King, three, don't always outthink the Gnome King. Stuff like that. One thing you can do, and this is actually, I've done this before. If you are a DM and you have a good grasp of the rules, you can make stuff up as you go along. I've done this before. In my Red Hand of Doom campaign, I would not really look at monsters' stat blocks, and I would just roll dice and determine whether or not I wanted to hit the player and how much damage I felt like doing at that time. So that it seemed from the player's perspective that it's a really hard fought battle, but from my perspective, it's just, this fight will end in the player's favor whenever I decide it will. The only time I didn't do that, oh, you know what? Let's not get off on that story tangent. The point is, sometimes you can you can run the game without ever referencing an objective rules source. I'm not running this character based on the stat block. I'm just running it based on what will seem the best in play. You can do the same with these traps, and the point I was trying to get to is you can let the PCs screw themselves. God forbid they offer up a good suggestion of what's going to happen when they do something. At first in the dungeon, you don't want it to be true. If they offer up something, if they start getting paranoid after the first few traps and they're like, oh no, don't step there, it'll probably, be a pit trap or something. You can start collecting their ideas, their paranoia, their paranoid creativity, and then using it against them later on, or even immediately, every once in a while, maybe just let them think that they managed to get in the head of the Gnome King, and so they figured out what his trap is going to be. Not necessarily how to get past it, but at least they figured it out. There's a certain amount of, what's the word I want? Accomplishment one can get from that. So you can engineer that as you go. You can have a set of, your own idea of how this trap works, but if the PCs offer up something, you want to manage the level of tension so that they keep thinking they can get past it a little bit, but they really aren't. That would actually be a good idea. Have a hall where the traps are really, where basically the PCs make it through everything. I wanted there to be a section where the traps are really obvious and every single one of them is fake. If you were to just walk down this hall, nothing bad would happen to you. It's only when you start tinkering with the fake traps where you start triggering real traps. The pressure plate that makes the obvious scythe blade swing out of the wall, that pressure plate does nothing. But tinkering with the scythe blade releases poison gas or something. That would be creepy, and that would, oh, it's so fun. Players, I'll just offer this up right here at the end of the video. Players hate traps, especially traps where everything is just mediated by a die roll. I could probably do another video on this too. You want traps to engage the players, not just the player characters. Because if it's just engaging the player characters, that's just rolling a search check and then just rolling a disable device check. And so the PC's fate is entirely up to the dice. Whereas if you make tricks, traps, and puzzles that engage the players, then you can engage the dice, they can roll for stuff, and they can use their own brains and know-how to figure stuff out. I'll probably talk about the Challenge of Champions in a video. Now, I'll add that on to my list of video ideas. Bye bye.